Hello everybody, and welcome to my channel on hereditary spastic paraplegia, which I will do my best to refer to from here on out as HSP. I imagine if you're here, you know of someone, maybe you, maybe a loved one, maybe you and a loved one, a friend, I could keep on going, but perhaps you know something about HSP. And the reason I say that is because HSP is a very rare neurological condition. In fact, there are fewer than 50,000 cases of HSP in the United States. I think the prevalence worldwide is something like 3.6 people. I don't know what the 0.6 means, but 3.6 people per 100,000 people have HSP. Now, a caveat there is that there is a lot of misdiagnosis. Sometimes people are diagnosed with cerebral palsy, actually, when in fact they have HSP. But I'm not going to get into all that right now. But it's a rare condition. I am not a doctor. I should have said that probably from the beginning. I'm not a doctor of any kind. But I am someone who's recently been diagnosed with HSP. And so I have some, maybe some authenticity to talk about HSP, certainly to talk about my experience with HSP. And please, please, please understand when I talk about my symptoms of HSP and what I've experienced thus far, it's just my experience. In fact, the interesting thing about HSP is that it's kind of an umbrella term that covers a lot of different typologies, if you will, of HSP. So one person's experience of HSP is not everyone's experience of HSP. So I was diagnosed about 6 months ago, maybe a little bit less, with HSP SPG7. And what that means is that is the gene that I have that is responsible for the spasticity I experience in my lower limbs, i.e. my legs. And oftentimes, HSP is experienced, oftentimes, I want to make sure, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes HSP is experienced as spasticity in the lower limbs. It is, and this is kind of rough to say, but it is insidious and it is incurable, which sounds really awful, but it's not really the worst thing. It's not a walk in the park, no pun intended, but it's not the worst thing, I don't think, for me. So interestingly enough, when I was tested, I had a genetic test for HSP, and I highly recommend those of you who are kind of wondering to consider, of course, talk to your doctor about this first, but to consider genetic testing as well to see if you have a gene that's been identified as being responsible for HSP. Again, I'm not a doctor, so take my advice with a grain of salt and a pound of sugar. Make sure that you have a doctor, a neurologist who you have a good relationship with and you trust their judgment. So I had genetic testing, came back SPG7, and then my mom, because she's the only one of my two parents left alive, my mom also had genetic testing, and it came out, so to speak, that she had, and I'm going to try and get this word right, I'm looking off to the side because I've written this down, an autosomal recessive copy of SPG7. And so what that means, what I think that means, but like I said a couple times now, I'm not a doctor, what that means is that she had a recessive gene, half a copy of a recessive gene, my dad had half a copy of a recessive gene, and together they made me. Now, I would have rather had a tan, but you know, they were married for like 7 years before they had me, so it wasn't just like a one-night stand, so I don't feel so bad about it. I don't feel bad about it at all. But that's been my journey in being diagnosed with HSP, sort of in a nutshell. But I think the bigger thing that I want to talk to you all about today and start a conversation about is my experience with HSP. And so I think that one may ask, when did you first experience symptoms of HSP? And I think that would be, I think it is a hard thing to answer. And maybe at the same time an easy thing to answer, because I actually think I first started experiencing symptoms of HSP on May 19th, 1978. That's when I was born. I don't actually remember all the way back then, but I think I've had sort of, anomalies to how I walk, particularly, for years. So going way back, and some of these things that I'm going to talk about, I'm not sure really that they are related to HSP. They may not be. But again, there are things that I experience and things that I look back on now that I've been diagnosed with this condition. I'm sort of like, I wonder. So here we go. So when I was very young in elementary school, the elementary school I went to had, it was very long for an elementary school kid, and it had sidewalks that went the whole length of the building. And they were actually they weren't terribly wide. They were kind of thin. So the reason I tell you that is because one line of students could go on one side and one line of students could go on the other side. So invariably, like a two-way system, a kind of informal two-way system was set up. So one line would go this way while another line came this way. Well, on the edge of the sidewalk that faced the grass or the yard, it was like about a 6-inch drop from the top of the sidewalk to the grass. And I noticed as a kid that I always seemed to, whenever I would be on that line that was walking against the edge, as a kid, my foot would always drop off that edge of the sidewalk. Now again, I have no idea if that means anything really, but it seemed to me that I noticed that happening a lot. I remember it all these years later. And the thing that was interesting to me about that as a kid, frustrating to me as a kid and more interesting to me now as an adult, I don't remember any other kids doing that to the extent that I did it. And I'm going to say I did it all the time, perhaps it's being dramatic, but it seemed to happen a lot, enough that I noticed it. My foot would seem to always drop off, like I didn't necessarily have control of that foot completely. And interestingly enough, that would have been my right foot, which my physical therapist tells me, by the way, go to physical therapy if you have HSP. It really helps. By the way, so my physical therapist tells me that my right leg is actually not as strong as my left leg. I had no idea. But, makes me think back then, makes me wonder. So fast forwarding a little bit, when I was late teens, early 20s, when I was in college, I would stumble. I'm going to say a lot, but I don't know that it was a lot, but it was enough that people noticed it. And, they'd kind of make jokey comments about it, if you will. I'm not sure, how jokey those comments were. They're probably kind of mean, but, it's just being in your late teens, early 20s, right? So I would stumble. And the reason I would stumble, and this stays with me to this day, is that whereas most people walk heel-toe, did you like the sound effects? Heel-toe. I walk toe-heel. So without the sound effects, I'll show you. Pretend my hand is a foot, as it were, and so heel-toe. I walk toe-heel. And so I sort of have this propensity to strike the floor like this, which can cause me to stumble. So that happened relatively frequently when I was in college. Another thing that happened when I was in college is a little bit of time travel. So when I was in college, I did this wonderful thing where I studied abroad in Italy. It was not for everybody, but I enjoyed it a lot. 4 months abroad in Italy, blah, blah, blah. So the place where I went to school in Italy was part of an ancient Roman circus. A textile factory had been built onto it, and now it was classrooms. So there was this really funky stair, as it were, that sort of wound up the side of the building that you have to walk up to the top of the building to go to class and come down to go to lunch and leave at the end of the day. So, keep that in mind. In the last 5 years, I went back to visit in a professional capacity this place where I'd gone to school in Italy. And so it'd been about 20 years. So I remember when I went back, I was walking down those same set of stairs, and right, the rise and the run, they aren't consistent at all, going down or up, because they're the same, down and up. But I was walking behind the person who is the director of this Study Abroad Institute now, and she had been the director then, right? And so I'm almost to the very end of the stairs, and she's in front of me, about 4 stairs below me, and she leaps off, she leaps like 4 stairs, she jumps from 4 stairs to the landing right before the door and heads out, just like that. Well, I knew when she did that, I was impressed with her, because she's like, 50, 60, very impressive, and I knew, I'm not going to do that. I can't do that. It's hard enough for me, and I didn't want to admit this to myself at the time, but it was hard enough for me just to kind of negotiate down those stairs. And in that moment, I knew that something had really changed over the last 20 years, right? And the other thing I knew is that when I was in my 20s, I would have done the same thing. I would have hopped down and walked right out like it was nothing. Now, that might not be the most advisable thing to do. I got to promise you, it wouldn't be a very advisable thing to do at all now for me. But I couldn't do that anymore. So, I kind of ignored it at the time, or I tried to push it to the back of my head. Obviously, I didn't, because I still remember it. But I thought, wow, that's interesting. Okay, so back on this timeline. All right, so in my early 20s, I would be walking, and again, I think this happened mostly on my right side, which again, my physical therapist said that's like the weaker of my two legs. So I would be walking in my early 20s, like that. That's walking. And my right ankle would just fold over. Literally, like my foot would just fold over, and I would, stumble. I wouldn't fall, but I would stumble and catch my balance. And, I did it so much that I remember being sort of like, I'm gonna break my ankle. And I haven't broken my ankle. And I don't do that really as much. I do it from time to time, but in my early 20s, it was not unusual for that to happen, just like walking somewhere. I don't know, walking to the movies, walking down the driveway, something, and my ankle would turn over. So that was one thing. Another thing that was really, really interesting that happened in my early 20s, around the same time that this was happening, was that I would be, again, walking somewhere, and I would get this, like, electric, this is the best way I can explain it, like this electric shock that went from my skull down my spine, or maybe it was in the other direction, but nonetheless, it was like this electric shock. And I realize what I'm describing to you is a sign, or can be a sign of multiple sclerosis. I've had an MRI. I go to a neurologist. That's apparently not what I'm dealing with here, but I did have that symptom in my early 20s. I haven't had it for years and years and years, decades actually now. But I do remember that happening, because it would it would shock me, and I would just kind of like, what the hell was that? And I thought, pardon my language, I thought I thought it, and maybe it was, but I thought it was because I was, going to the gym a lot at that time. So I thought maybe it had something to do with, I don't know, compression or something I was putting on my spine, and maybe it did, but I don't know. So as I move into my 30s, by the way, I'm in my 40s now, 45. As I move into my 30s, one of the things that happens, and it's more of an observation of other people about me that I get a lot, is people will say, I'll be walking next to them and people will say, "Are you limping?" And that question would on one hand, it would annoy me, but I think that was a secondary reaction to the fact that it was disconcerting to me, because being the internalized, anxious person that I am, I would start thinking like, what's wrong with me? Why am I limping? Right? And I would always play it off like, no, I'm not limping. I know I don't have any pain, which I didn't, and I don't. But that happened a lot. That question came up a lot, too much for me, I think. I don't know what a lot is, but I had that question. Multiple people would ask me that question: "Are you limping?" So another thing in my 30s, at work, I had an office that was adjacent to a white hallway, and interestingly enough, so at the end of the day, I would look at that white hallway right outside my office door, and there'd be all these scuff marks leading right into my office. All these scuff marks leading right into my office. And that's because I was not picking my feet up. I was doing that toe, heel, right? It was intense how many scuff marks were on this white floor. It looked like a piece of modern art, as it were. Maybe not, but kind of. So around the same time, mid-late 30s, going into my early 40s, a little girl asked me, well, she wasn't a little girl, a young woman asked me, are you shuffling? Why, or not, are you shuffling? She said, "Why do you shuffle when you walk?" And that question, again, it annoyed me, but that was sort of a secondary emotion to like, why am I shuffling? Because there was something else that people had said to me for a long time, since I was in single digits, that I shuffled. Like I would make, I don't know if you can hear that, I would make like this noise when I walk, like, I think someone one time said, "Why do you walk like an old man?" And I think in my mind, I just kind of played it off, or I tried to play it off like, it's just the way I walk, it's just my gait. And I think I also, though, concurrently in my mind knew, yeah, it's probably not, there's probably more to it than that, but that's how I kind of played it off for myself. So, speaking of playing it off, as I get into my early 40s, there was something that happened. And it wasn't really a big thing, but there was this thing that happened that was sort of like that's more than ... So we went on a trip, a little vacation, to Montreal. It was in the fall. Anyways, so we flew up there from where we live in Orlando. That flight, it's not a long flight, it's not short, but it's 3.5 hours. And the reason I tell you that is because maybe it's long enough to be a little stiff when you get off the plane if you've been sitting the whole time, but it's certainly not a long haul flight, as it were. But anyways, when we landed in Montreal, we got off the plane. I'm walking down the hallway, like going to customs and baggage claim and whatever, and I just noticed that my legs are really stiff in the sense of like tree trunks, like they're hard to bend almost. So it just didn't seem normal. I'd been stiff before. It just seemed beyond stiff. Like it was hard to bend my legs almost to walk. I was walking like bum, 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 rather than walking fluidly. And eventually, though, in that trip, that went away, even though it was a little chilly outside. And I noticed then, too, that would return, especially when it got really cold. And I also remember at that time noticing, like, oh, well, that's happened my whole life. When it gets cold, my legs get stiff. That's happened my whole life. And I think I just assumed that was just a normal thing. Like, literally, when it got cold, again, bum, 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 without the sound effect. Rather than just kind of the fluid, back and forth with my legs. So I remember that, and that stiffness. I'm going to describe it as stiffness, actually spasticity, but that stiffness, it went away. Now coming to now, fast forwarding to now. I'd rather not say this, but my legs are pretty much always stiff, always spastic now, to varying degrees. Sometimes I'm real spastic, and sometimes I'm a little spastic, but nonetheless, I'm spastic. So another thing, as we talk about now, is that it's more difficult, and I hate to say that, but it's true, it's more difficult for me to go down stairs or go down an incline. Like, I have to negotiate with myself. Like, I know what I want to do, but it's like a negotiation. The best kind of analogy I could give for it is like, I know in my mind what I want to do, but to get my legs to do it, it takes some time, which can create instability. It's, I suppose, the communication channels in my brain, telling my legs what to do when they're going down, is like the difference between going from Florida to Maine and taking I-95, and that's normal, and going from Florida to Maine and taking US 1. That's rough. But unfortunately, that's how it is for me, especially if I'm going downhill. The other thing I do now in my 20s, or no, gosh, I'm not in my 20s anymore. I'm in my 40s, 45. Sorry. The other thing I do now is something called scissoring. And what that is normally when people walk, and this is a good thing, you walk and your legs are parallel to one another, right? You're parallel. I don't know how effective my fingers are for legs, but you're parallel. And when you turn, your legs are still parallel. Well, what happens with me, because of the spasticity in my legs, is I can very easily, if I turn, I can do this. I scissor, my legs will scissor, and that will create or cause me to have instability. Several months ago, I was in a museum, and someone said something to me, and I scissored, right? I turned around to face him, I scissored, and I fell. It wasn't like a bad fall, but as my physical therapist says, like, any fall isn't great. And it was also a little bit like ego bruising, which is the least of all concerns for a fall, really. But it was disconcerting. And so what I do now, at times, not always, but at times, is I will use a walking stick to make sure that I'm stable as I walk. I have to admit to you, I don't like doing that. I don't like saying that I have to do that. But I do that, and I think it's a good idea for me to do that. Another thing, when I'm walking downstairs, it's been a couple months ago, I resisted the urge to hold on or even get close to a handrail. And it's not good. Nothing happened. Luckily, I came to my senses. And I make sure to use a handrail, to be close to a handrail when I'm walking downstairs, because not to do that is selfish to those around me, to my loved ones. So those are some of my experiences right now with HSP, or where I'm at right now with HSP. In about a month, I'm going to have some treatment, the second treatment to my legs of injection of Botox to help the spasticity in my legs. And we'll see how that goes. So I hope to see you all again. If you like this, please, and this is, kind of cheesy, but I'm going to say it anyways. If you did like this, please like and subscribe down below or wherever that is. And I hope this is helpful, and I hope that we can build community for those of us with HSP, or just those of us with neurological conditions perhaps, or maybe just enjoy hanging out with me on whatever day of the week it is, whatever day of the week it is when you're watching this. So thank you very much, and I will see you soon.